November 21st, 18-0-6. A palace in Berlin. Napoleon Bonaparte sits at his stolen desk signing a piece of paper. History books will tell you that Napoleon lost because he invaded Russia. They'll say it was the snow in the distance that killed him. They're wrong. Napoleon didn't lose on a battlefield. He lost on a balance sheet. The document he signed that day in Berlin wasn't a battle plan. It was an economic suicide note. He declared war not with cannons, but with customs officers. And the weapon he chose would bankrupt him before it bankrupted his enemy. This is the story of how an emperor tried to strangle Britain with paperwork, how he turned Europe into a prison of his own making, and how the richest military machine in history ran out of money while wearing British boots. At the height of his power, Napoleon controlled more territory than any European ruler since Charlemagne. The French tricolor flew from Amsterdam to Naples. His brothers wore crowns in Spain and Holland and Westphalia. When he rode through Paris, the streets glittered with looted gold from a dozen conquered capitals. The Arc de Triomphe was rising. The franc was backed by the silver of Mexico and the diamonds of Venice. To a casual observer, the French Empire looked unstoppable, permanent, divine. But beneath the marble and the metals, the foundation was rotting, because Napoleon had a problem he couldn't shoot his way out of. 20 miles of cold gray water, the English Channel, and on the other side, an island that refused to kneel. Britain was untouchable. The Royal Navy had 30 ships of the line for every warship France could float. At Trafalgar in 1805, Admiral Nelson had shattered the combined fleets of France and Spain. The invasion barges Napoleon built at Boulogne were firewood. He could conquer Vienna and Berlin and Madrid. But he couldn't land a single soldier on the beaches of Kent. He was a lion trapped on land. And Britain was a shark he couldn't reach. So Napoleon looked at his enemy and saw something else. He saw that Britain wasn't a warrior state. It was a merchant state, a nation of traders and bankers and factory owners. They didn't grow their own food. They imported grain from Poland and beef from Ireland. Their wealth came from exports. Cotton mills in Manchester, iron foundries in Birmingham, wool from Yorkshire, and all of it flowed out through the port of London to customers across Europe. Napoleon had a realization. If he couldn't invade Britain, he would starve it. He would cut off its customers. He would close every port on the continent and watch the British economy collapse under its own weight. The mills would shut down. The workers would riot. The banks would fail, and Britain would be forced to surrender not because it was conquered, but because it was bankrupt. He called it the Continental System, and on paper it was brilliant. In practice, it was a trap, and Napoleon was the one who walked into it. The Berlin Decree of 18-0-6 was simple and brutal. No ship from Britain or its colonies could dock at any port under French control. Any British goods found on the continent would be seized and burned. Any British citizen found in French territory would be arrested as a prisoner of war. It wasn't a naval blockade. It was an economic blockade. A customs wall stretched across the entire coastline of Europe. From the Baltic to the Mediterranean, French soldiers and tax collectors patrolled the docks with orders to search every cargo hold. Napoleon believed he could control trade the way he controlled armies. He thought the market would obey his orders. He was wrong. You can court-martial a soldier who disobeys, but you can't court-martial supply and demand. The British responded with fury. They issued the orders in council. If Europe wouldn't trade with Britain, then Europe wouldn't trade with anyone. The Royal Navy declared a counter-blockade. Any neutral ship sailing to a French-controlled port had to stop in Britain first. They had to pay a license fee and submit to inspection. Britain was saying it owned the ocean. If you wanted to sail, you paid the toll. This created chaos for the merchants of the world. An American captain sailing from Boston to Hamburg was trapped between two empires. If he obeyed the British and stopped in London, the French would confiscate his ship when he arrived. If he obeyed Napoleon and skipped Britain, the Royal Navy would seize him at sea. Legal trade became impossible. Prices exploded. Coffee that cost 5 francs in 1805 cost 20 francs by 1808. Sugar became a luxury. Tobacco vanished from the shops. The people of Europe who had tolerated Napoleon's wars began to hate him. He had promised them glory and enlightenment. Instead, he was taking away their morning coffee. But Napoleon had made a fatal miscalculation. He underestimated greed. As soon as legal trade was banned, illegal trade exploded. Smuggling became the most profitable business in Europe, and the British government, pragmatic as always, decided to help the smugglers. They seized a tiny barren island in the North Sea called Heligoland. It sat just off the German coast. The British turned it into a warehouse, a supermarket for contraband. Every week, merchant ships from London would unload millions of pounds worth of cotton and sugar and tobacco onto the docks. And every night, under cover of darkness, hundreds of small boats would row out from the German and Dutch coasts. Fishermen, smugglers, opportunists. They would buy the goods with gold and disappear back into the fog. The French customs officers were overwhelmed. The coastline of Europe is thousands of miles long, full of coves and inlets and river mouths. Napoleon couldn't put a soldier on every beach, and even when he did, the soldiers could be bought. A French customs officer earned maybe 10 francs a week. A smuggler could offer him a year's salary to look the other way for 5 minutes. The corruption was universal. It went all the way to the top. One of Napoleon's own marshals, Masséna, was rumored to be selling trading licenses under the table. Even Josephine, the Empress herself, continued to buy British muslins and silks because she preferred them to the French alternatives. Napoleon was trying to blockade Britain while his own wife was wearing British cloth. The most absurd example came in 1812. Napoleon was preparing to invade Russia. He needed to equip an army of 600,000 men, boots, coats, blankets. The French textile industry couldn't produce them fast enough. The quality was poor and the prices were inflated. Napoleon's quartermasters faced a choice: send the soldiers into the Russian winter barefoot, or deal with the enemy. They dealt with the enemy. In a secret transaction approved by both governments, the French army bought thousands of boots and coats from British manufacturers. The British sold them happily. They knew that gold was more valuable to the war effort than boots. So the Grand Army marched into Russia wearing boots made in Northampton and coats woven in Yorkshire. It was economic insanity dressed as patriotism. But even with the smuggling, the Continental System was doing damage, not to Britain, to Europe. The port cities of France were dying. Bordeaux and Marseille had been built on shipping. Now their docks were empty. Grass grew between the cobblestones. The merchant class, which had supported Napoleon during the Revolution, was facing ruin. They blamed the emperor. He was sacrificing their livelihoods for a war that had no end, and the system required constant expansion. A blockade is only as strong as its weakest link. If one country allowed British goods, those goods would flood across the borders and undermine the entire system. Napoleon became obsessed with plugging the leaks. This obsession pulled him into wars he didn't need. Portugal refused to close its ports. It was an old ally of Britain, so Napoleon sent an army through Spain to occupy Lisbon. This triggered the Peninsular War. French soldiers found themselves trapped in a brutal guerrilla conflict that lasted 6 years. It drained men and money and morale. Napoleon called it his Spanish ulcer, and he caught that ulcer because he was trying to enforce an economic policy. He bullied his own family. His brother Louis was king of Holland, but Louis refused to crack down on Dutch smugglers. He loved his subjects more than he feared his brother, so Napoleon forced him to abdicate. He annexed Holland directly into France just so he could send his own customs officers to patrol the canals. He was cannibalizing his alliances to sustain a blockade that wasn't working. At the center of this financial war was a family that would become legendary, the Rothschilds. Nathan Rothschild operated out of London. His brother James operated out of Paris. Together, they ran a banking network that ignored borders and blockades. They had their own couriers, their own fast boats. They moved gold and information across the channel faster than any government could stop them. The British government used the Rothschilds to fund the Duke of Wellington's army in Spain. Gold minted in London was smuggled through France to pay British soldiers fighting French troops. Think about that. The money to fight Napoleon was being moved through his own empire by bankers who operated in both capitals. It was a masterpiece of financial subversion. And then came Russia. By 1810, Tsar Alexander was watching his economy disintegrate. Russia was an agrarian giant. It exported timber and hemp and grain and tallow. Its biggest customer had always been Britain. When the Tsar closed his ports, Russian exports collapsed. The ruble lost half its value. The Russian nobility, who owned the forests and the fields, saw their wealth evaporate. They began to whisper about assassination. Alexander's father had been murdered by his own courtiers for similar reasons. Alexander tried to compromise. He placed tariffs on French luxury goods. He turned a blind eye to neutral ships entering Russian ports. Everyone knew those ships were carrying British cargo, but Alexander needed the trade. He needed the revenue. He was choosing economic survival over political loyalty. Napoleon saw this as betrayal. He believed that if Russia was allowed to cheat, the entire Continental System would crumble. Other nations would follow. The blockade would collapse. Britain would win. He decided to make an example of Russia. He would force the Tsar back into the system at gunpoint. This is the tragedy of 1812. It wasn't a war for territory. Napoleon didn't want to rule Moscow. He wanted to close Russian ports. It was a police action carried out by 600,000 soldiers. A war fought over a trade embargo. In June of 1812, the Grand Army crossed the Niemen River. It was the largest invasion force in European history. Soldiers from France and Germany and Italy and Poland marched east into the Russian steppe. They were marching to enforce a customs regulation. The disaster is well known. The Russians retreated and burned their own cities. Moscow went up in flames. Napoleon waited in the ruins for a surrender that never came. Winter arrived early. The retreat became a massacre. Men froze to death in their sleep. Horses collapsed and were eaten. Of the 600,000 men who marched into Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it back. But the human toll was only part of the disaster. The economic toll was worse, because the moment Napoleon's back was turned, the Continental System collapsed behind him. With the French army deep in Russia, enforcement loosened. British goods poured into the Baltic ports. The smugglers became bolder. The very thing Napoleon went to war to prevent happened because he went to war. And when the broken remnants of the Grand Army stumbled out of Russia, the fear of Napoleon evaporated. The nations of Europe rose up. Prussia, Austria, Sweden. They weren't just fighting for independence. They were fighting for economic survival. They wanted access to British markets. They wanted British subsidies. They wanted to trade again. The final campaigns of 1813 and 1814 were funded by British gold. The British government, having survived the blockade, poured millions of pounds into the coffers of Napoleon's enemies. They sent muskets and gunpowder and uniforms. The wealth that the Continental System failed to destroy was now being weaponized to destroy its creator. At the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Europe. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and outfinanced. The coalition had more men because Britain paid for them. They had more artillery because Britain shipped it. Napoleon was defeated not by superior tactics, but by superior accounting. When the Allied armies marched into Paris in April 1814, one of their first acts was to abolish the Continental System. The decrees were torn down. The customs officers were dismissed. The ports were thrown open. British ships sailed into French harbors for the first time in 8 years. They were greeted with cheers. Merchants rushed to buy coffee and sugar and cotton. Prices dropped overnight. The people celebrated not because the war was over, but because they could afford breakfast again. Napoleon was exiled to Elba. He escaped a year later and fought one last campaign. Waterloo finished him. He spent his final years on the island of St. Helena dictating his memoirs. He argued that the Continental System would have worked if he'd had more time, if the Russians hadn't betrayed him, if the Spanish hadn't rebelled. He never understood that the system was doomed from the start. You cannot command an economy like you command a regiment. Trade is like water. You can build a dam, but eventually the pressure rises and the dam breaks. Napoleon tried to redirect the flow of global commerce with decrees and soldiers, and the market crushed him. The legacy of the Continental System is profound. It proved that economic power is as important as military power. Napoleon won almost every battle he fought, but he lost the war because he couldn't balance a ledger. He bled his own empire dry trying to strangle Britain, and in the end he was the one who suffocated. The system had unintended consequences. Because Europe was cut off from tropical sugar, French scientists learned to extract sugar from beets. It was a breakthrough that changed agriculture forever. Because Europe couldn't buy British textiles, local industries in Saxony and Alsace developed. But when the war ended and the borders opened, most of those industries collapsed. They couldn't compete with British efficiency. It was a lesson in the dangers of protectionism. For Britain, the victory was total. They had withstood the greatest economic siege in history. The Bank of England emerged as the financial center of the world. The Royal Navy was unchallenged, and the trade networks Britain built to survive the blockade especially in South America and Asia, became the foundation of the Victorian Empire. Britain had been forced to look beyond Europe, and in doing so, it became a global superpower. Napoleon's empire lasted less than a decade, but the debt it created lasted generations. France didn't finish paying off the costs of the Napoleonic Wars until the late 19th century. The financial strain contributed to every French Revolution and coup for the next 50 years. The bill for Napoleon's ambition was paid by his grandchildren's generation. Sovereignty is solvency, that's the lesson. You can have the best generals and the bravest soldiers and the most brilliant strategies, but if you run out of money, you lose. Napoleon commanded the largest army in Europe, but he couldn't command the price of coffee. He conquered capitals, but he couldn't conquer the market. The smugglers of Heligoland didn't carry muskets. The bankers of London didn't wear uniforms. The bootmakers of Northampton never saw a battlefield. But they were the ones who defeated the emperor. They proved that the ledger is mightier than the sword. And that's how a nation of shopkeepers brought down the master of Europe. History isn't written by armies. It's written by accountants. By the price of bread and the interest on debt and the flow of gold across borders. Napoleon understood war, but he never understood money. And money always wins. If you want to understand how empires really fall, you need to follow the cash. Subscribe now because most people won't learn this until it's too late. They'll read about the battles and the generals and miss the real story. The story written in ledgers and loan agreements and customs receipts. The story of how the world is really run. Don't be one of the ones who only sees it when the bill comes due. Empires collapse in silence, and by the time the historians write about it, your money is already gone.